This podcast is brought to you by Free Buddhist Audio, the Dharma for your life. Our work is funded entirely by donations from our generous listeners. If you would like to help us keep this free, make a contribution at freebuddhistaudio.com/donate. Thank you, and happy listening.
Thank you, Saraha, and greetings to everybody. About 5 years ago, I had the unpleasant experience of partially losing my eyesight. I think most of you know about that. And as you perhaps also know, throughout my life, I've been a great reader. So to lose my eyesight, even partially, was quite an affliction. But even so, there are always compensations, even for afflictions like that. And one of the results was that I started listening to the radio a little more than I had been doing. Also perhaps seeing more people than I had been seeing. But listening to the radio over the years, I noticed something. I noticed that every now and then there would be an anniversary celebrated. There seems to be quite a lot of anniversaries around. I remember the 200th anniversary of the Battle of Trafalgar. That was celebrated with a few programs. And more recently, there's been programs around the 50th anniversary of the signing of the Treaty of Rome. And at present, on the anniversary front, we're in the midst of all sorts of programs about the Falklands War of 25 years ago. And of course, looking beyond secular events to events of a Buddhist nature, which have been celebrated in recent months. Looking back to last October, there was the 50th anniversary of Dr. Ambedkar's conversion to Buddhism, which of course was followed by the conversion of tens of thousands, even hundreds of thousands of people in India and elsewhere. So many anniversaries. And it does seem that anniversaries are rather important. They have a collective importance. They have an individual importance. There are collective anniversaries. There are individual, personal anniversaries. They form part of our history. They remind us of what has happened. They help create continuity. They help create a story. They help to create a sense of either collective or individual, personal, identity and continuity. And so it is therefore that today we are celebrating the 40th anniversary of the founding of the FWBO. I must say that I was a little disappointed actually when I learned that there wasn't going to be the usual big national celebration here in the UK. I understand, though, that plans are afoot to give us next year a bigger and better celebration, not of course of our 40th, but of our 41st anniversary. And I suppose we shall have to be content with that. I'm assured that it will be something rather different and very attractive, and many people are expected to attend. But anyway, even though there isn't this year a national celebration of FWBO Day, well, here in Birmingham, we're celebrating it, and I'm very glad to see and to know that people are coming to take part in this celebration from a number of other centres. And it's very good that we could all be together on this occasion. And naturally my thoughts go back, my thoughts fly back to those very early days, 40 years ago. Sometimes it seems a long time ago, sometimes it doesn't seem very long ago. I was, I think, 41 at the time, still a comparatively young man, and as I remember those early days, there rises in my mind a quite vivid picture of just how and where we started. We started, of course, very small. We were a bit bigger now, of course, but then we were very small indeed, just a handful of people. And we didn't even have a centre of our own, not one that we actually had bought. Our first activities, our first classes were held in a very modest basement in Monmouth Street in central London. As far as I remember, the basement was about 12 feet square, 12 feet each way. And with a bit of juggling, we could get 20 chairs in. Because in those days, of course, people did not sit on the floor to meditate, they all sat on chairs. That gradually changed. And when we had our inaugural dedication, we allowed a few people to stand and we squeezed in, altogether, 24 people. 24 people. And I led, and we all recited, a dedication ceremony that I'd composed only the evening before. And thus we dedicated what we called our Triratna Shrine and Meditation Room. And that was how and where the FWBO began, 40 years ago. And the first kind of activity we started up was meditation classes. Perhaps that has a significance of its own, that we should have started there. Meditation being, of course, such a very important aspect, such an integral part of the Buddhist spiritual path and the Buddhist spiritual life. So we started with meditation classes. And we very soon had 2, even 3 meditation classes. There seemed to be, at that time, quite a demand for them. Of course, there was quite a big turnover, but our meditation classes were usually quite full. That means we usually had 8 to 10 or 12 people. I must admit, though, that on one evening when I came along to the basement shrine, ready to take the meditation class, I found only one person had come. But that's the sort of thing that does happen, as all of you who have ever taken classes at FW centres will know only too well. Only the other day I heard about someone having organised something and taken a great deal of trouble, and when he turned up to take his part in the proceedings, he found nobody else had come. So it can still happen occasionally. And, we have to practice patience and optimism and not lose heart. I certainly didn't lose heart on that occasion because there were other encouraging signs. And of course, the meditation that I was teaching was first of all mindfulness of breathing, and then of course after a while I started teaching the Metta Bhavana. Both these meditations, especially I must say the mindfulness of breathing, had been very important in my own spiritual life in India for quite a few years. And I know that these practices continue to be taught in all our FWBO centres, and they lay, as it were, a firm foundation for our practice of meditation in the FWBO and the practice of the spiritual life generally. Mindfulness of breathing can take us very, very far, as I'm sure practically all of you know. From mindfulness of breathing we can go to mindfulness of the body and its movements generally. We can go to mindfulness of our feelings, our emotions, mindfulness of our thoughts, of every thought that passes through the mind, every imagination, every dream. And we can go to mindfulness of the Dharma, mindfulness of the teaching of the Buddha, even eventually to mindfulness of reality itself. So, mindfulness of breathing can take us a very long way, and we shouldn't doubt that. Similarly, the Metta Bhavana can take us a long way. Starting with the Metta Bhavana, we can practice the Karuna Bhavana, we can practice Mudita Bhavana, and we can practice Upeksha Bhavana, the Bhavana of complete tranquility, within which we find it difficult to make any distinction between how we feel towards others and how we feel towards ourselves. And that can lead us right into the heart of the Dharma, into Naratmya and Shunyata. So these two practices, seemingly so simple, so straightforward, mindfulness of breathing and the Metta Bhavana, are, as it were, the two twin pillars of our practice of meditation. We may take up other practices in the course of our spiritual life, and they may be very helpful, but at rock bottom we need these two practices. So we had meditation classes, and after a while there were some people who wanted a more extended practice of meditation. They wanted to go deeper. And of course, if you're just sitting for a couple of hours, you can't always go very deep, especially if you're coming straight from work, as many people did in those days, to those classes. So we started holding retreats, week-long retreats in the countryside. It was, I think, in West Sussex. We went to a place called Quatermain and another bigger place called Kefalds. Some of you who were around in those days will probably remember those two places. And we had what has come to be, I think, a standard sort of FWB retreat consisting of talks, meditation, periods of silence, walks and talks together, pujas, study, and so on. And I have very pleasant memories of those far off days. I can remember, the day when we introduced, or rather I introduced, the communication exercises. I noticed that people didn't always find it very easy to communicate with one another. So I thought, well, what to do? A bit more mindfulness might not help very much, even a bit more Metta Bhavana. So I bethought myself of these exercises, which I'd learned in India many years before, from an English woman who'd devised them on the basis of what she'd received from various teachers. And I introduced these exercises, and they had an almost miraculous effect. People really opened up with one another. So after that, the communication exercises came to form a sort of regular part of the FWB repertoire. And I believe that there's still sometimes used on retreats when perhaps people aren't opening up with one another quite sufficiently. So we had these retreats. And I remember also that at the end of the week, people would be loitering at the gate, waiting for their transport, and looking very sad, looking quite unhappy. They'd been very happy all during the week, in fact increasingly happy, but they were very, very sorry that the retreat had ended. It would be on a Sunday evening, of course, and on Monday morning they were going back to work. But in the course of the retreat, I noticed such a remarkable change in people. They would arrive looking rather tired, perhaps a bit fed up. But as the days progressed, they became more happy, more positive, even more communicative, and one could see with one's own eyes that the Dharma, even a little of it, did really work. And this reminded me very strongly of the fact that conditions are important, and it is a duty, as it were, almost to oneself, that if one wishes to practice the Dharma, one does one's best to make sure that one creates as best one can the conditions, the lifestyle even, that enables you to practice the Dharma and does not get too much in the way. So I saw this very clearly, and I've remembered it. And this also brings me back to a time in my own life when a change of conditions made a very big difference and had a very definite effect on me, a lasting effect on me, I think. Saraha referred to the fact that we're also celebrating the 60th anniversary of my going forth. I hadn't actually intended to say anything about that. I had intended to keep it for another occasion, but this morning, just thinking over what I was going to say, I thought, well, why not? Huh? Why not say a little bit, at least a little bit, about my going forth? Huh? Perhaps I will give a full-length talk about it at some point, but meanwhile, let me say just a little before carrying on from where I'm leaving off. Those of you who've read my memoirs know how I went forth from a place called Kosali with a friend, having given away my worldly possessions and wearing the yellow robes, shaven-headed, all that. And I spent at least a couple of years wandering here and there, staying in different places with this friend. So I sometimes ask myself, well, why did I do it and what did I learn? Well, it's 60 years ago and it's not easy to look back and say exactly what my motivation was, except that I wanted to lead a thoroughly Buddhist life as near to the life of the Buddha as I could at that time. But one of the motivations that I had was that I wanted to go forth from any sort of civic or national identity. Of course, I was in India as an Englishman, as a foreigner, and I threw away my identification papers so that I was, as it were, anonymous. I didn't have any national identity, at least in my own mind. And that is one of the things that I learned at that time. You may in your own mind not identify yourself with any particular group, social, national, caste, class, but other people will want to identify you. You sometimes have to fight quite hard to retain your non-identity, if you see what I mean. But that was in a way my ideal, not to consider myself in my heart of hearts as being English as opposed to some other nationality or nationalities. And I understood that to be an essential part of the spiritual life and attitude of the monk. Subsequently, I discovered that most Buddhist monks in the East were intensely nationalistic, and this rather disappointed me. But I still uphold this ideal that we should try to see ourselves as Buddhists as citizens of the world and not identify ourselves too closely with any particular nationality or culture or conditioning of that kind. So that's one of the things. And of course I was wandering in India, and I came to know a lot about India in this way, at a grassroots level. I knew what village life was like and small town life was like, and like the Indian open road was like. I had that experience, and that helps to give me a great love of India and the Indian people, which deepened as the years went by. And there was something else. Since I was a wanderer, a parivrajaka, I described myself in those days as, a freelance wanderer. A freelance wanderer. By freelance meaning I did not at that time belong to any Buddhist group or society or organization or order. So a freelance wandering ascetic, that's how I described myself. And of course, not having any occupation, any means of livelihood, I was dependent on other people. And sometimes quite literally was with my friend at one stage begging my food, especially after I was ordained as a samanera and had actual begging bowl. I was dependent on other people for my food, and sometimes for shelter at night. Sometimes, of course, there was no shelter, and we slept in the open, wherever we could. But there was always food. That was very interesting. I don't think we ever went hungry, even though although at that time we were dependent on other people for food. And this gave rise at the time, and still gives rise to various reflections. That experience was very important for me because it showed me in a very concrete form the way in which we're dependent on other people. Now, today I had lunch. I expect most of you did. So how was it that I had lunch? I didn't prepare it myself. It was prepared by Sanghadeva. Now, how was it that Sanghadeva was able to prepare lunch? Well, the vegetables and other things were all there. But where did those vegetables come from? Well, apparently there's a man who comes along once a week and brings potatoes and carrots and things. So where does he get them from? Well, he gets them from the wholesaler, I think. And where does the wholesaler get them from? Well, gets them perhaps from the farmer, but maybe there are even more intermediate stages. So we are very dependent on other people. And not only dependent, but interdependent. And sometimes we forget that. But I was very sharply reminded of that fact every day when I was during my wandering period. And of course, much of the time, wandering from place to place, we slept in a different place every night for some periods. Just once or twice settling down for a while. And that meant that I developed a sort of sense of detachment to place. And even after coming back to this country, I've lived in a number of different places. I lived at the Hampstead Vihara, then in a succession of flats, and I've lived at Padmaloka, I lived at the LBC, I lived at Tattershall, I lived in Cornwall, I lived in Castleacre, lived in London again. Now I'm living here in Birmingham. So I've learned to be quite independent of place, and quite happy to move to a new place. And I find that even now, if I go and stay for a few days, maybe at Padmaloka or at Sri Ratnaloka, never have any difficulty sleeping, as some people do when they change their bed for the night. And I always feel quite at home, wherever I happen to be. So that, I think, is a part of the legacy of those wandering days of mine, all those years ago. So I've learned those lessons, and perhaps on some future occasion I'll talk at greater length about them. But anyway, back to what I was saying about these retreats, which we had in the very, very early days of the FWBO. When I say early days, I mean the first 5 years, when the basement in London was our headquarters. I have other recollections, some of them quite amusing. I can remember on one occasion I heard some screams coming from part of the building, and I investigated, and there were 2 or 3 women rushing up and down the passage, screaming at the tops of their voices. I don't know why they did it. Maybe they were letting off steam. I don't know whether that still happens from time to time on retreats. Perhaps it does, or perhaps not. But anyway, one of my recollections. And of course I started giving lectures, and they were very well attended, I must say. We had many more people coming to the lectures, which were held in hired halls, than we had coming to the meditation classes. And after a while, of course, people started thinking of perhaps living together. So our first community came into existence during that period, which was at Sarum House, as it was then called, in Purley. I believe there's still a community there of some kind, though I'm not quite sure what kind of community it is at present, but some people are still there. So there's an element of continuity. So in the course of those 5 years, quite a lot happened. Quite a lot. Things happened quite quickly. It's as though we got off the mark quite quickly. There was a lot of enthusiasm, there was a lot of interest. There weren't many of us, but we were all very closely connected. We saw each other very, very frequently. We were meeting all the time, whether in connection with the classes or the lectures or the poetry group that we started, or meeting in tea shops and cafes. I remember that Ananda in particular was a great lover of tea shops and cafes, and he used to work on his poetry and his novel, the first of many, sitting in a tea shop or a coffee bar. And I sometimes used to meet him, and we'd have a walk along the embankment together, discussing the Dharma and poetry and Zen and the form of the novel and all that sort of thing. So I've many happy memories of those periods, that period rather. But of course, we were helped by, well, I suppose I could say that the zeitgeist, the spirit of the times. I'm talking about the late 60s and early 70s. Things were very different then, and again I'm talking about London, I suppose, mostly. Things were very different then. There was a different sort of atmosphere around, an atmosphere of experimentation and new things, changes in all sorts of walks of life. Experimentation, well, we had the the Beatles, didn't we, in those days? Some of you perhaps remember them. And there are all sorts of other groups that I just don't remember the names of. Since there were the Beatles, there was the Maharishi, a very colourful character one heard on the radio, sometimes with his high-pitched laugh. I can't really, I'm not quite high-pitched enough, but there was a real high-pitched sort of cackle, a transcendental cackle, I suppose. And then there was Guru Maharaj, the boy guru, that people flocked to. He's quite forgotten now, I think, at least in this country. And of course Zen was in the air. Several of our own friends were very interested in Zen. Ananda was very interested in Zen, and so were several others. And of course, yes, there was a smell of something which I perhaps shouldn't mention in the air. That was sometimes very much in the air. I mean, not in the FWBO, but if one joined the queue to attend a certain kind of film, well, there would be a certain sort of pall of smoke, hanging over the whole queue. And yes, it was the days of psychedelic drugs and experimenting with Oriental music, new forms of literature. I remember Jack Kerouac's novels were very popular in those days, and in the FWBO too, and also Eric Fromm's writings were very popular. So there was definitely a almost sort of supportive spirit in those days, a spirit that was supportive of any new sort of spiritual venture rather than antagonistic to it. Of course, not everybody was affected by this zeitgeist, as I've called it. It wasn't really a fully fledged zeitgeist. It affected only a portion of the population, at least in London. But it did affect them. And we, as it were, took advantage of that, or were able to take advantage of that. And I've sometimes thought that if I'd returned to this country 10 years earlier, it would have been very difficult to found an FWBO. And had I arrived 10 years later, I would have missed the bus, so to speak. So it seems I arrived just at the right time, 64, and then, after a spell at the Hampstead Vihara, started the FWBO in 1967. So in a way we rode on the crest of a wave. There was at least some external conditions at the time, cultural conditions, social conditions, which supported us rather than opposed us. There's the simple example, for instance, of the possibility of squatting. At that time, squatting was legal, believe it or not, under a law passed, I forget in the reign of which king. I think it was in the reign of one of the Edwards in the Middle Ages. And the law was passed to allow what we call squatting because of the fearful depopulation that had followed the Black Death, when a third of the population of this country perished. So that law was still in force, under which you could squat in an unoccupied house, unoccupied premises. Of course, that law was speedily repealed. But meanwhile, some of our friends had that advantage. They didn't have to pay rent, and that helped. And also in those days, it seems, employment was very easy for young people to get. They didn't mind giving up work for a few months, because they knew quite well, as soon as they needed some money, as soon as they needed a job, they could just go and get one. I believe it isn't quite like that now, so people are a bit more economically conscious. So we had the advantage of riding to some extent on the crest of this wave. It certainly did make things easier. But of course, things have changed. It's very difficult to say exactly how they've changed, but it's as though the economic imperative is stronger. Perhaps materialism is more rampant. Consumerism certainly is more rampant. Individualism is more rampant, and so on. And all that tends to move against any attempt, collective or individual, to lead the spiritual life. We are really up against it very often. As I know from some of the people who do come to see me, it isn't easy to lead or to try to lead a spiritual life nowadays. Of course, it's never been easy. It's intrinsically difficult anyway. That reminds me of two sayings. One comes from Dr. Ambedkar. At the time of his conversion, he said, "Make no mistake about it, Buddhism is a very difficult religion to practice." And I heard a Tibetan proverb from some of my Tibetan friends who said, "If it isn't difficult, it isn't religion." Which is very uncompromising indeed. But of course, the present time is not the only time in history when, if you want to try to lead a spiritual life, or even if you try just to be objective, to see things as they are, even on the ordinary everyday level, it's always been difficult. And in this connection, I'm reminded of something I read or came to know about years ago, which was Sir Francis Bacon's doctrine of the idols. Sir Francis Bacon was one of the first great modern philosophers. He was very roughly, a contemporary of Shakespeare, and he wrote a number of very important philosophical works, which I suspect are not much read nowadays, though his essays are still read, I believe. He wrote a work called Novum Organum, which was meant to overthrow the logic of Aristotle and replace it by something more empirically grounded. And he propounded a doctrine of what he called the idols. The idols were those things in the human makeup, in the human mind almost, which prevent us from seeing things truly. He was thinking more in terms of what we would call scientific truth, or what was then called natural philosophy, but what he said certainly has a wider applicability. He said there were four kinds of idols. There were the idols of the tribe, there were the idols of the cave, there were the idols of the marketplace, and there were the idols of the theatre. Now, by idols of the tribe, what did he mean? By tribe he meant the whole human race, Homo sapiens. He said there are idols, mental limitations, so to speak, conditioning, which we share inasmuch as we're just human beings, which get in the way of our seeing the truth. And he thought that one of the biggest idols was our love of comfort, that we prefer comfort to truth, and that we have a tendency, therefore, to believe what pleases us, what appeals to us, what we like. We're not so much concerned with truth. We are more concerned about comfort. And this, of course, leads to what he calls superstition. And one could even bring in here, belief in a personal God. That belief gives you comfort, makes you feel safe. So people usually, I think, believe in God not because they've been argued into that belief, but because they want to feel safe, comfortable, protected, even loved. So idols of this sort are common to all human beings. We're all subject to the temptation to believe something because it feels comfortable to believe it. And then, of course, the idols of the cave. The idols of the cave are the personal limitations of each individual human being. Their individual, personal conditioning, due to which they see things in a particular way, have certain prejudices, certain preferences, and so on. These are the idols of the cave. And then, what about the idols of the marketplace? The marketplace, of course, is where people meet, where they exchange news, where they exchange ideas. So the idols of the marketplace, according to Bacon, are the limitations that arise due to the nature of language itself and the difficulty of, so to speak, using language properly, reasoning properly, and being clear in our thinking, in our definitions. So that's, broadly speaking, the idols of the marketplace. And then finally, the idols of the theatre. He doesn't mean theatre in our modern sense. He uses the word in a rather strange manner. According to him, the idols of the theatre are, simply, as we would say, wrong views. And especially wrong views are systematized into erroneous systems of belief or thought. So, Bacon propounded this doctrine of idols, the 4 kinds of idols, all those years ago. And I think they're still quite applicable. They form a quite useful framework, I think, for us to look at ourselves and our conditioning. It does occur to me that someone might lead, an order member especially interested in philosophy, might like to lead a seminar studying these 4 classes of idols of Sir Francis Bacon. Would be quite interesting and stimulating exercise. And now where have we got to? Yes. We are up against it if we're trying to lead a spiritual life, up against it individually, up against it collectively. There are all sorts of ideologies around by which we may be ensnared. I've mentioned individualism. I think that's one of the most important, one of the most lethal. There's consumerism, there's commercialism, there's materialism in general, and so on. And of course, we sometimes find that even our Buddhist thinking is affected by these other ideologies that are around. We find people trying to bring together maybe Buddhism and Christianity, or try to bring together the Dharma and some form of therapy, mix them up together. I remember when I was in the States once, when I was at Yale, someone came to see me who was very enthusiastic about behaviorist psychology, and he was convinced that, it was more or less the same thing as Buddhism. He found it very difficult to accept from me that the two were really rather different. So we do get to the danger of the possibility of the purity of the Dharma being adulterated by elements, ideological elements, that really have no connection with the Dharma. And I'm sure you can all think of some examples for yourselves that you've encountered or have even had to wrestle with, from time to time. And in this connection, I came across a quite interesting book recently. It was written by Dzongsa Khyentse Rinpoche, who is believed to be an incarnation of Tulku, of one of my own teachers, Jamyang Khyentse Rinpoche. Dzongsa Khyentse Rinpoche is a modern incarnate Lama. That is to say, He's well acquainted with English. He has quite a good knowledge of Western culture. And you may have heard of him as the director of a film called The Cup. Yes? Yes. So that may help you to identify him. And he's recently published a book. And it's called, now see if I can get it right, What Makes You Not a Buddhist? Huh? No, that's rather a surprising question. And he's had quite an extensive experience teaching the Dharma, especially perhaps Tibetan Buddhism, in various parts of the Western world, not only in the States and Europe, but also in Australia and New Zealand. And he must have come across some rather strange Buddhists, or what one might call hybrid Buddhists, half Buddhist and half something else. And as a result, he's written this book, What Makes You Not a Buddhist? And of course, he's said that what makes you not a Buddhist is that you do not wholeheartedly accept and entrust yourself to the 4 Dharma Mudras. The 4 Dharma Mudras. What makes you not a Buddhist if you do not accept the 4 Dharma Mudras? So what are the 4 Dharma Mudras? They're a quite traditional list. In fact, they're very traditional and very well known and often mentioned in Buddhist literature, canonical and otherwise. And there are various versions, and Rinpoche has produced his version. I hope I can see it. Some of it may sound familiar, some not. All the compounded things are impermanent. All emotions are pain. All the things have no inherent existence. Nirvana is beyond conception. So these are the 4 Dharma Mudras. And why are they called Dharma Mudras? Well, what is a mudra? There are many meanings of this word. The one that's relevant here is a mudra is a seal. If a document has a seal, somebody's personal seal or an official seal attached to it, do you know that the document is genuine? Nowadays, of course, we don't have seals so much as signatures. But the Dharma Mudra, or the Dharma Mudras, are those seals, as it were, that guarantee that this is the teaching of the Dharma, this is the Buddha's teaching. If a teaching bears these 4 seals, it's authentic. If it doesn't bear them, or if it contradicts them or disagrees with them, it can't be authentic, it cannot be Buddhist. So this should give us a great deal of food for thought. Because more often than not we tend to ask, well, what is it that makes a Buddhist? But Rinpoche has turned it completely round. What is it that makes one not a Buddhist? And you're not a Buddhist if you don't believe or accept that all compounded things are impermanent. And that means all. All means all. If there are any exceptions, if you make any little exceptions, you're not a Buddhist. Your belief does not bear the stamp of the Dharma seal. And all emotions are pain. That's a more difficult one, perhaps. Of course, emotions like hatred, fear, jealousy, anxiety, uncertainty, these are quite obviously painful. But what about things like love? Some people would say, well, there are emotions which are not painful. But if they're not immediately painful, well, sooner or later they may become painful if you lose that emotion for any reason. If you see, and in any case, no emotion, even no positive emotion, even according to the Dharma, can give you complete and final happiness or joy. So all emotions are pain, and then all things have no inherent existence. There's no permanent, unchanging soul or self. That, of course, as I'm sure you all know, is one of the basic doctrines of the Dharma. Yes, one of the four Dharma Mudras. We've studied that, no doubt, quite a lot in the past. And nirvana is beyond conception. It's very easy to talk slickly about nirvana or about enlightenment or bodhi. But do we really understand what it is? Do we really know? It's much better if we think of it as a mystery, something beyond our conception. And it's good also if we can think of the Buddha not as just that well-known historical character, Siddhartha Gautama, but as a very mysterious, distant personality, if we can even use that word at all of him, that word personality. Someone very distant, very mysterious, very almost numinous, as it were, rather than being somebody about whom we do know quite a lot. We know quite a lot about the circumstances of the Buddha's life, and we know what he did in a sense. We know about his effect on his contemporaries, especially his disciples. But do we really know what the Buddha was really like? Do we really have any understanding of what his experience, his enlightenment was in its depth? So we have to recognize that nirvana is beyond conception. So I think Dzongsa Rinpoche has performed in a way a very useful service, and given us really, when I say us, given all Western Buddhists really something to think about. We as Western Buddhists have to ask ourselves, do we really accept? Do we really believe? Do we really have faith, as it were, in these four Dharma Mudras? If we don't, we have to accept that, well, we're not Buddhists after all, or perhaps much less Buddhists than we really thought that we were. So I hope that Rinpoche's book will be found in FWBO bookstores, and that at least some of you will read it and perhaps study it. So I think it's very good, it's very appropriate that on this day, when we're celebrating the 40th anniversary of the FWBO, that we should be thinking along these lines, that we should even, in a way, go back to fundamentals, asking ourselves, not just what makes us Buddhists, but also what does not make us Buddhists. I think it's a very useful exercise. So we had the four Dharma Mudras, of course, are common to the whole Buddhist world. In principle, in theory, all Buddhists accept the four Dharma Mudras. We just have to be certain that that is really the case, so far as we personally are concerned. So, in the FWBO, there's so much that we have in common with all other Buddhists. We have, of course, in common the teaching, the Four Noble Truths, the Noble Eightfold Path, the Paramitas, the Three Lakshanas. We have so much in common. But we also have our own distinctive emphases, what I've called the 6 distinctive emphases of the FWBO. And I want to conclude by just reminding you all of those, in case any of you may have forgotten, what they are. So, and just to make sure that I haven't forgotten what they are, at least the order of them, I provided myself with an aide memoir in conveniently large type. There's the centrality of going for refuge. Going for refuge to the three jewels. This is something that we have in common with all Buddhists. Going for refuge is what makes you a Buddhist. And of course you can go for refuge on a number of different levels. And some of you, or most of you I'm sure, are familiar with those levels, the provisional, the effective, the real, and so on. So I won't say much about that. Perhaps not many people need a reminder as regards the centrality of going for refuge and the fact, therefore, that lifestyle is a quite secondary matter. Of course, secondary does not mean unimportant, because secondary means that if the going for refuge is primary, the lifestyle is secondary in the sense that it is an expression, at least in part, of the going for refuge. And then, of course, we have an order, and that order is what I call a unified order. That is to say, it is an order which is open to men and women alike on equal terms, and that in it, men and women alike have equal responsibilities and equal duties. We've got so used to do this in the FWBO that we take it for granted. It's rather unusual in the Buddhist world, to say the least. Usually there is a very strict, even rigid, separation between monks and laity on the one hand, and of course men and women, bhikshus and bhikshunis, upasakas and upasikas on the other. But we have this unified order. And then of course we're an ecumenical movement. Buddhist literature is so vast. There's so many Buddhist teachings developed over the centuries that we feel free to draw upon whichever of them give us inspiration and guidance. Whether it's the Pali Suttas, where the Buddha himself is speaking, or the songs of Milarepa, or the enigmatic sayings of the great Zen and Chan masters, we like to draw upon all that great treasury and integrate it into our own FWBO approach to the Dharma. And then, of course, the spiritual friendship. In a way, this is one of our discoveries. Spiritual friendship is mentioned in the Pali scriptures, and of course, there is one particular famous place where the Buddha, in discussion with Ananda, says that spiritual friendship is not even just the half of the spiritual life. The brahmacharya is the whole of it. And we've taken this utterance of the Buddha very, very much to heart, in a way in which I believe, so far as my knowledge goes, has never happened before in the history of the Dharma. There have, of course, been friendships between Buddhists throughout Buddhist history, but not this explicit emphasis on the almost the supreme importance of spiritual friendship in the spiritual life. And then, fifthly, there's team-based right livelihood. Now, I'm well aware that that's not quite so fashionable as it used to be, and I regret that. And I hope that this phase of unpopularity or relative unpopularity will soon pass. There's a sufficient number of people, order members and mitras alike, who do have a strong faith in team-based right livelihood and the possibilities of friendship and generosity which it offers. And I would say even that it's one of the most positive situations that we have in the FWBO, especially in the form of Windhorse evolution, which has been responsible for producing, so to speak, so many fine order members, and which has helped to support much of the movement and its activities over the years to a very great extent. And finally, last but not least, well, none of these is least, the spiritual importance of the arts. We've always emphasized this, and within a year or two, of course, of the establishment of the FWBO, we had a poetry group. And I think we've had groups of this sort all through our short history. Of course, there are the Wolf at the Door workshops, which play a very important part in this connection. And I believe they are continuing. So here we are, celebrating the 40th anniversary of the FWBO, reminding ourselves, among other things, of something of our history, reminding ourselves what we have in common with all other Buddhists, the sort of questions we need to ask ourselves, and how we need to also remind ourselves of the 6 distinctive emphases of our own movement.
We hope you enjoyed this week's podcast. Please help us keep this free. Make a contribution at freebuddhistaudio.com/donate. And thank you.